Good afternoon, Michael Malice here. Let that be our welcome for the next hour. We have with us a special episode, and this is the second time in 2 weeks the same thing has happened, which is I have had a guest who I am an admirer of, who I've been working to get on the show for weeks, if not months, who has a new book out, and I'm all excited to get the book. It's Abigail Shrier. Her first book was called Irreversible Damage. This one is out this week. It's called Bad Therapy: Why the Kids Aren't Growing Up. And I get it. I'm all excited to read it. I turn it over into the dust jacket. The first thing it says is an investigation into a mental health industry that is harming and not healing American children. And that's when I put the book down and I'm like, all right, if I read this as an uncle, I'm going to get so angry and so upset. And then I'm going to talk to you and I'm going to get even more angry and more upset. So I'd rather talk to you and have a nice time and prep myself and then read the book because for me, when and not for me, this is not unique to me. When harm is done to children, it hits differently. There's something almost like inhuman about it because it's so unnatural. It's so avoidable in the sense that, like, if there's one thing I would think everyone has a consensus on wherever on the political spectrum, protect kids. Like, if you see a kid, if I see a lady, I'm a New Yorker, if I see someone fall down in the street, it's funny to me. If I see a kid be harmed, it's, you run and you want to protect that kid. It's such a natural instinct. I just to have one little light note. The cover is here. It's for those who can't see. It's a girl in a bell jar. We'd like to do show and tell in the show, so I actually have here. I have a first printing of the bell jar by Sylvia Plath. It came out under pseudonym, so this one is really hard to find. And I just recently lost an auction for a handwritten letter of hers that I was going to hang over my oven, but I thought, you know what? That's an in joke that only 5 people will get, and it's not appropriate anyway. But the levity aside, I'm trying to have some levity here. Um, the, I don't even know where to start. But let's just start on a personal level. Like, when you're doing research like this, before we get into specifics, and you're hearing about harm being done to kids, how do you keep sane?
Okay, so first of all, it's great to meet you finally, and I'm thrilled to be on the show. So thank you so much for having me. But here's what I want you to know. You should read the book, but
Oh, I'm gonna read it, I'm sure.
especially if you're a parent, and here's why. Because I can understand as a, let's say, as an uncle, it's very upsetting to read things that are not helping children, things that are maybe counterproductive, and feel like you can't do anything about it. But parents can fix this one. There are a
Okay.
lot of things parents can't fix, but the problems of the mental health industry taking over way too much of American childhood is actually a problem parents have entire power to
Oh,
fix.
that's wonderful. Okay.
So I really feel like, and I felt this way writing the book. Look, I have 3 kids in the rising generation. I wanted to know what was wrong with all these kids. Why were they so unhappy?
Yeah.
And they hadn't lived through any World War, no Great Depression. They were suffering so deeply. And here was the crazy part. They had gotten more mental health treatment than any American generation on record. So they should be the picture of mental health. Instead, they were the picture of despair.
Oh, that I mean, well, okay. I was gonna read it already, now I'm even more excited to read it because one of my books was about North Korea, and when I was doing interviews about that, people were like, they're very moved, of course, and they're like, "Well, what can I do?" And my answer was always like, "I have no idea." Like, what can you do as an American, right? Like, there's literally a nuclear arsenal between you and helping these people, an entire political edifice. But the fact
Right.
that parents are in a position to actually prevent a lot of this, okay, you've spoiled the happy ending. That makes me feel very reassured. So let's talk a bit about the thesis of this book, and I think more specifically how we got to this point. Because I'm sure you agree, and I know you're going to be attacked. Oh, she's saying no one should go to therapy. She's saying you're right. No, mental illness doesn't exist. Like, you're clearly not saying that. I don't need to even ask you that. But can you get to what the thesis is here?
Sure. Bad therapy is therapy that's unnecessary and therefore makes your symptoms worse or introduces new ones. That's the problem. The problem wasn't with mental health care, which frankly, we don't have enough of in this country, right? We have schizophrenics on our streets. It's no surprise to anyone that there's an incredibly underserved population that actually needs to be on medication and needs to be, probably a lot of them, in an in-treatment facility, right? But instead, we're doing so-called preventive mental health care meant at attacking wellness. It is unnecessary, and I do believe it is making all kinds of mental health problems much worse, especially in kids and adolescents.
Yeah, lefties have this very common criticism, which I don't think is at all irrational, that businesses and doctors have an incentive to keep you on the hook for years instead of treating you, because if they treat you, they're out of patient. But when you apply it to the mental health industry, somehow that analysis goes completely out the window. And can you talk more specifically about what are some of these tactics and how children are being targeted?
Sure, absolutely. So, one of the things is when I started writing the book, I did not think, I knew that this generation was suffering and I knew they were unhappy, but I didn't think it was because of mental health professionals. First of all, 40% of them have been in therapy, of the rising generation. Now, that's a lot, but it's still not half. So, I didn't think, since, the majority weren't in therapy, I didn't think therapy necessarily explained what was wrong with them. But then, as I did, and I sold the book, by the way, on a totally with a different hypothesis, which was that it had something to do with the way the kids were raised. But as I started investigating sort of the experience of this generation, I started realizing not only were so many of them in therapy, not only did 42% of them have a mental health diagnosis, but in schools, they were getting therapeutic treatments like social emotional learning and various kinds of group therapy. Their parents were using parenting techniques they took from therapists. So the best-selling parenting books were all of a sudden written by therapists. And I started realizing that therapy, what I call bad therapy, was being crop dusted across the entire population. And I think it was making them, and there's a whole body of research on this. Some of the side effects, the negative side effects of therapy, include things like making your depression worse, making your fears or anxiety worse, making you alienated from mom and dad. These are all, and also a feeling of incapacity, feeling like I can't do for myself. I have to ask an expert or adult. These are all classic effects of therapy, and they're exactly what we're seeing in the rising generation.
I think that we live in a culture where being a victim of some kind is a status marker. And I think there's some kind of taboo that when status is a goal, that human beings, either consciously or unconsciously, are going to seek that status. So it's very easy for a kid to be like, okay, now I'm this or I'm that. And all of a sudden they're special. They have special treatment. They have to be treated with kid gloves. I visited, I think a lot of us, we hear about some of these mental health conditions and you're like, oh, that sounds like me. And like for me, like sometimes I'll hear a story and like, I don't care about this person. Like, oh, am I a sociopath? Well, first of all, if you're asking yourself, you're not. And then I visited Michael Alec in jail, who actually was a club kid killer who was a sociopath. And I got to tell you, when you actually meet one of these people, it's not a thin line between
Right.
sometimes I'm callous. It's like, oh, you're a Martian. Like your brain is completely wired differently than mine. So for something to be diagnosable, like in the DSM-5, it's not like, oh, sometimes I'm insecure, I have bad days. On paper, it's I have a condition that renders me completely incapable of functioning on a day-to-day basis. It's not just simply I'm depressed, I'm having a bad mood.
That's exactly right. And I love that example because that's the problem. People will, I'm sure, accuse me of not taking mental health disorders seriously. Actually, it's the reverse. When you had a bad time in middle school, as young people obviously have done forever, but today they describe it as PTSD. I can't drive past my high school or my middle school because that gives, because of my PTSD. They so trivialize mental health disorder, but
Yeah.
but worse, they're talking themselves into it. So 86% of the rising generation, according to a recent spate of articles, says they have menu anxiety. They're afraid to order from a menu in a restaurant and need to have their friends do it for them. They're talking to themselves into what I call emotional hypochondriasis. They're basically emotional hypochondriacs. And hypochondriacs, I interviewed the world expert Arthur Barsky of Harvard Medical School on this. One of the things I learned is hypochondriacs aren't people who fake it.
You're right. Yeah.
Hypochondriacs is a severe, horrible illness, but it is people who feel some pain or some physical problem. And instead of ignoring it like the rest of us do, they start to focus and obsess
Yeah.
over it.
Yeah.
And then it becomes bigger. They can't ignore the pain all of a sudden. And that's what I think the young people are doing with their emotional lives. It's not that they don't have real pain, it's that they're devoting themselves into focusing on it. They even make it an organizing principle. And once you do that, it's very hard to move past your eighth grade breakup.
Yeah, if I don't feel like going to a party, that doesn't mean I'm an agoraphobic, right? Like
Exactly.
I don't wanna leave the house, I like my house, but, talk to someone who's agoraphobic, and this is night and day. I think that's really key, the distinction that you're making. But do you have any, thoughts as to how we got to this point?
Yeah, I have to admit one of the big sort of problems was I'm the tail end of Gen X. I was born in 1978, and Gen X parents we were big believers in therapy. We entered therapy maybe because so many of us had gone through divorce. It was the high watermark of divorce in America. Our parents divorced in greater numbers, and we were the Goodwill Hunting generation, and we really believed in therapy, and we believed that therapy could only help. Talking about your problems could only help. Well, as I, talk about in the book, there's no intervention, no matter how good, that can both has the power to help and also doesn't harm, right?
Yeah.
Anything with the power to help can also harm. So an x-ray is an example. Of course, we need x-rays, but you don't want to sit in an x-ray machine and take needless x-rays because it'll expose you to radiation. And the same is true with therapy. If you need it, if you have anorexia, or your daughter does, by all means, get her help. But that's not what we're doing. We're taking bummed out kids, we're calling it depression, and we're sending them off to therapy and psych meds. And that takes an acute problem and turns it into a chronic one.
Yeah, imagine if someone's anorexic and the treatment is, well, this is your identity. You're going to be struggling with food and starving yourself for the rest of your life, right? Like no one would think this is a normal approach, but especially now, I'd love to hear you talk about the impact of social media on this because I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts. Having these conditions now becomes some identity politics thing. Like I'm a person who has Tourette's or all these other kind of situations, and now there's a huge disincentive to get treated or have it resolved because then it's like, well, now I'm normal. And that is a low status thing.
That's right. I mean, so one of the things that I didn't know when I started writing the book and didn't believe was that, well, how do we know that the therapists weren't there to help? Maybe they were only responding to a need, right? Our mental health had deteriorated. Maybe they were just the answer. They were the firemen, not the arsonists,
Yeah.
But I don't think that anymore. And there are a few reasons. One of them is that we should see we should see with any treatment that's prevalent and accessible, we should see the rate and incidence, what they call point prevalence of a disease, go down.
Yeah.
With depression, we've seen it skyrocket with increased access to mental health. But there's something else too, and it's what you just said, what you just brought up. One of the other reasons is we're seeing them in their social media profiles talk about themselves as ADHD. They are identifying, an entire generation is identifying with and valorizing mental health diagnosis. They are swimming in these concepts. It's not that they started out depressed, it's that I have depression. I am, it's not that I could ever be shy. No, that's my social phobia. It's not that I am a little inattentive in class or I'm bored. No, that's my ADHD. They're completely wearing these cloaks of mental health diagnosis. And that's how they think of themselves. That's how they identify their problems. That's how they speak. And I think they're sort of talking themselves into, far worse mental health problems than they actually have.
Well, there's a difference between having like a mental health issue and having mental health problem, right? Like
Yeah,
if I'm like a slacker or I'm lazy or if I'm have bad days a lot, okay, like being depressed is an issue, but that's again nowhere near the same of someone who has suffers from chronic depression, and I don't wish that on anybody. I've had friends who've dealt with it, and guys, it's not at all the same as, oh, I don't feel like getting out of bed, or my work
that's
kind of
right.
sucks, or I hate my relationship. It is a paralyzing, crippling, consistent condition. And anyone who would encourage people to maintain themselves in that state, this is just like a torturer. It's just absolutely horrific.
And when you said something earlier about, the difference between true mental illness and there's really a sort of bright line. There is a difference between people who are abjectly suffering and those who feel bummed out, right? And if you've ever seen someone really suffering with depression or anything, any of the other things you mentioned, it's really different. And yet, when I interviewed Gen Z members of the rising generation, like I interviewed one young woman, Nora, who's a senior in high school in California, and she talked about her friends' diagnoses, and as if they were all on the spectrum of madness, right? This one had social anxiety, this one had depression, this one had social phobia, and it was all as if they all existed on a continuum with the woman who shows up naked to Target.
Yeah, right.
They didn't see themselves as fundamentally different. And by the way, when they survey these kids, less than half of them believe their mental health is good.
Yeah, it's kind of like, our for our parents, it would be like Paul McCartney's the cute one, and maybe Ringo's the funny one, and now I'm the ADHD one, or I'm the one who's depressed, or I'm the one who's. I'm curious to hear your thoughts as to, and maybe there's something you don't talk about specifically, the astronomical increase in the rates of autism diagnoses, because is it a function of we're just spotting it where we didn't spot it before? Or is it a function of any kid who's just a little bit weird is being, diagnosed as being on the spectrum, or is it somewhere in between?
It's a great question. I deal with ADHD in the book, and I deal with parents who I profile a man in Israel. His name was Yaakov Ophir, who had been he was a academic psychologist at Israel's Technion, which is a research institution, and he had in his clinical practice been putting kids on recommending ADHD medication and diagnosing with ADHD. And then his own 4-year-old, the teacher said, had ADHD. And this really threw him. The kid was only 4, and the teacher and the medical professional he took the kid to said, "You really have to start him on ADHD medications right now." The boy was only 4 years old. And this completely threw him. And he went on a journey to figure out, what is ADHD? And do I
Yeah.
really have to put my child on powerful stimulants that over time will get less effective? So
Yes.
he'll have to get more and more. And why? Just so he can sit still in school? It's not a disorder like others, right? It doesn't encourage harm to yourself or others. The only real problem with this kid was sitting in class,
Yeah.
and he was 4. And the problem is what you say. It's not just that we're diagnosing all these kids, which is a problem, by the way. It's not neutral. It's not nothing to think, "Oh, I just have something wrong with my brain. I can never learn to sit still." But then we start them on a course of medication from which they, depending on the drugs, whether it's SSRIs, which they never seem to get off, the stimulants for like Adderall, you need more and more. They have high risks of things like, various kinds of chemical dependency. This is not something you lightly want to start your kid on just because the teacher says he's not concentrating. And by the way, there are a lot of things you can do to change his environment that don't put this kid on a medication that stops him from feeling like himself when he's just trying to become himself.
Or maybe the teacher's just boring. I mean, I'm
Or
being glib, but it's a
that's
four-year-old
right.
boy. Folks, traditional bed sheets can harbor more bacteria than a toilet seat, which can lead to acne, to allergies, to stuffy noses, and it is gross. Miracle Made offers a full line of self-cleaning, eco-friendly bedding such as sheets, pillowcases, and comforters that prevent 99% of bacteria and require 3 times less laundry. They're infused with silver, and that prevents up to 99.7% of bacterial growth, which leaves them staying cleaner and fresher 3 times longer. No more gross odors. And by using these silver infused fabrics, which were inspired by NASA, the Miracle Made sheets are thermoregulating and designed to keep you at the perfect temperature all night long, so you get better sleep every night. They're very comfortable without the high price tag of other luxury brands. Stop sleeping on bacteria. Miracle Made sheets are designed for your skin. Bacteria can clog your pores. It causes breakouts and acne. Sleep clean with Miracle. Here's all you got to do. Go to trymiracle.com/malice to try Miracle Made sheets today. And whether you're buying them for yourself or as a gift for a loved one, if you order today, you can save over 40%. And if you use our promo Malice at checkout, you get 3 free towels and save an extra 20%. Miracle is so confident in their product, it's backed with a 30-day money-back guarantee. If you aren't 100% satisfied, full refund. Upgrade your sleep with Miracle Made. Go to trymiracle.com/malice. Use code malice to claim your free 3-piece towel set and save over 40% off. Again, that's trymiracle.com/malice to treat yourself. Thank you, Miracle Made, for sponsoring this episode. Let's get back to the show. Something I fight against very much is, kind of government education. And it comes from this Bismarck model where you have everyone who's taught at the same rate sit quietly because you're trying to make a platoon of, people who are going to be in the military when they grow up. And it's just crazy to me that it's just taken as a given that we're all going to learn at the rate of the slowest person. And if you are good at math, Abigail, and I'm good at geography, that we have to learn at the same pace as opposed to, individually. And that the best way for learning is sitting down, shutting the hell up, and listening to someone lecture to you. Whereas some people learn by reading, some people learn by listening, some people learn by doing, some people learn by watching videos. But we just take it as a given. So you can see how for this teacher, where there's this one disruptive kid, where it's just like all it takes is, just a phone call, we can dope him up and shut the kid up.
Right.
It's dark, but you can understand the thought process there, especially when it's become normalized, where there isn't this stigma that like, oh, I'm doping up this kid. It's like, I'm getting them help. It's the parents who are the problem.
That's exactly right, and you just said the conflict of interest is immense. A teacher has every incentive to keep the kid bolted to the chair, but I talked to parents who said one year the teacher thought they had ADHD, the next year another teacher thought they were a good student. So what had changed with their kid? Well, maybe they outgrew it, or maybe the teacher wasn't very good.
Right.
And or maybe it just wasn't interesting to the kid. Not everybody's going to find the same things interesting, but we're letting teachers be the number one source of ADHD referrals in our country. This is a highly conflicted source. And the other thing is there are a lot of things you can do in the environment, like take away his iPad before school, right? If he's sitting there looking at video after video, he's probably going to find the teacher pretty boring.
I've had friends who used Adderall recreationally. I don't know how you would put it. The point is they used it. Let me tell you guys, I've never done it myself. I've never tried it. When they talk about the withdrawal, they're like, you do not understand what it's like to withdraw from Adderall. Like, it's just like, if I know mentally that I just have to take that one more pill and I can make this like intense, like panic feeling go away, it's really hard to be like, no, I'm not going to take that one pill. These are adults. So
Right.
imagine if it's a child and the child is basically having a panic attack and they know that if I just take my Flintstone vitamin, the panic attack's going to go away. Of course, they're going to want to stay on this medication for perpetuity.
That's right. And look, the withdrawal is no joke for both, those medications, of course, the anti-anxiety drugs as well, and the SSRIs. But I'll tell you something else. The saddest part is that a kid who's never had the experience of learning to work harder
Yeah.
or get through a breakup and see that he can move on and go and make new friends after some other friend rejected him, he might never, or she might never know that they can, because they've only ever done it with a drug. So now they feel like to get through normal heartache or normal, ups and downs of life, they need that drug. And if we've put them on medication too early, they'll never know any different.
My great hero, Camille Paglia, described the current university system as, I believe I'm getting the quote right, institutionalized neurosis. That basically, that no matter how healthy you are, especially at the Ivy Leagues, no matter how healthy and well-adjusted you are, when it's like Harley Quinn. You come in and you're the therapist, and when you leave, you're the Joker's girlfriend, right? Because the environment is so toxic and so um, the pressure is so heavily oriented towards mental unhealth. Can you talk a bit about how, in your experience and your research, the university system is fomenting this kind of situation?
Well, wellness centers have cropped up at all the universities. They do things like, well, not all, sorry, at many universities, and certainly our most prestigious. I know Duke just built a giant wellness center, beautiful wellness center, and they invite everyone to come. They're treating a generation like they're mental health patients, and they think of themselves as mental health patients.
Yeah.
I talked to this one friend of mine. This really got me. She's an old friend of mine, and I had called her I call her every year for her birthday, and she runs a big research lab. She's a MD PhD as a cell biologist, and we've been friends since we were kids. And I called her this year, and I happened to mention what I was working on, and she said, "Oh, I got to tell you, she's not a terribly political person or anything like that, but she had real strong feelings about this, and she said, I have to tell you about the kids I'm seeing because every year." At her lab, she hires a group of post college pre-meds. So they completed their pre-med courses and they're doing a gap year of research before med school. And these are the top kids in the country. Okay. These are really smart, really together kids. And she said to me, she said, first of all, they're constantly updating me on their mental health. Like I'm a
Yeah.
research biologist. They don't have to tell me about their mental health, but they seem to think that reporting to me regularly about how they're doing with their anxiety is something we're supposed to talk about. So she's learned to do it. But the other thing that drives her crazy is that they're afraid to take any risks. She says they're afraid to not be amazing, but they're also afraid to try. She said, as a high school student, I never did this in high school because I wasn't, particularly strong in the sciences, but she was. And the other kids in our class, they all, volunteered at NIH because I'm from the DC area. And she was telling me, she's like, we were taking greater risks as high school students, trying out our own experiments, then I can get these kids after pre med requirements to even try. They're afraid. And one of the and I don't think this is an accident, one of the big side effects of therapy is what they call treatment dependency. It encourages a patient to feel totally dependent on an adult expert so that kids can't take the same risks they would have if they had just been left alone.
Can you discuss from your work, how much within the mental health industry is there some kind of self-criticism? Is there any sense of looking around and being like, guys, maybe we're on the wrong path? Or is it like, kind of like the COVID thing? We're all in, and anyone who questions this in any way needs to be, have their license revoked and driven out of town in a rail.
So that's an amazing question. So I found this incredibly bifurcated reaction. Um,
Okay.
in the research world, the academic psychologists are very aware. There's a whole body of research on what they call the iatrogenic effects of therapy. Iatrogenesis is, of course, when a healer in the course of treatment actually introduces a harm. And there are these known iatrogenic effects of therapy. That doesn't mean no one should undergo therapy, of course, just like people need to go to the ER if they're shot or they have a
Right.
wound. But you shouldn't do it lightly because there are these side effects. And they're known by researchers. And so are, by the way, of course, the side effects of all our, uh, uh, um, psych meds,
Yeah.
SSRIs, and whatever. These are well known by research scientists. But here was the crazy part. When I asked practitioners, ordinary therapists, school counselors, shrinks, MFT degreed therapists, can therapy harm a patient? Most of them would minimize it or deny it. Talking about
Right.
your problems can only help, they would insist.
Right.
Well, that isn't true, and the research has never shown that.
Yeah, yeah, because I can see both sides. In the one sense, they're fighting against this old, like maybe 1950s prejudice, the idea that going to therapy is bad and means that you're crazy. So, I'm sure there's some like a residue of that. But on the other hand, we live in a culture where the idea of trade-offs is supposedly not a thing. Like, for example, if you said, "Hey, you need to take this vaccine 5% of the population are gonna have bad side effects, but it's gonna work for 95%. Know the risks, but we're gonna be net benefit." Like, that would be more honest, but you can't talk like that. If something is good, it can't have any costs, and it has to be good for everyone. And to acknowledge it is basically, and what they're hearing is what I'm positive, this book's out this week. What you're going to hear over and over, and you know this, Abigail is saying therapy shouldn't happen. Abigail is saying no one should go to therapy. Abigail is saying that everyone who goes to therapy becomes crazy as a consequence, which is not all what you're saying, but they have this binary approach where any criticism or like finessing of, hey, let's move this in a more healthful direction is taken as, well, she just wants it to be thrown in the garbage.
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny that you say that because I love that. I always play this game with my kids whenever we talk about any policy or if the kids think come up with anything. People should be put in jail for littering or whatever policy we talk about. I always ask them to say, okay, and what are the costs of that? What would
Yes.
be the side effects? Because I tell them one of the worst things in our society is that we never talk about costs and benefits, and
Yes.
everything has costs and benefits, even a good policy. And there are costs to telling a kid there's something wrong with your brain and you need medication. And
Yeah.
there are costs to the
Yeah.
sense of self, right? But there are also costs to saying to a kid, you need therapy. I love you, but go speak to this expert because your problem is way above mom's pay grade. The
Yeah.
chance that that will affect a parent's relationship with their child are very considerable. Now, if the child really needs therapy, you don't have a choice. Just like if you have a gunshot wound, you go to the ER. But if you don't have a gunshot wound, you don't hang out in the ER because you're likely to pick something up. And that's the problem with therapy. Kids are picking up things through all the treatments we have in school, like social emotional learning, which often is a lot like group therapy. And we're encouraging them constantly to ruminate on their bad experiences or their pain. And that, of course, is not only something that's likely to increase depression or create depression if they don't already have it, but it makes it much harder for them to get anything done in life if they're thinking about mom and dad's divorce all the time.
Yeah, I could just tell everyone. I could tell. I mean, I would encourage everyone listening to this. Just imagine if when you were a kid and you fell down, you scraped your knee, and you're crying, and mom or dad's like, "Oh, there." If like every imagine like week after week, like remember that time you skinned your knee and how
Right,
awful that was. Like,
right.
what would that effect would that have on your mental health? What effect would that have on you learning how to ride a bike or play sports? You would absolutely be like, "Oh no, 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 I'm not going through it again." But then like take a step back, you skin your knee. We all did it. It's fine. Like it sucks for the moment and you're a kid, your brain freaks out like what just happened, but you mom gives you a little lollipop or the ice cream and you get over it.
That's exactly right. It's commonsensical, and the best research backs up exactly what you just said, but we're not following it. So, for instance, parents are taught, and there are all kinds of therapeutic parenting methods that are very popular now, like gentle parenting, and parents are taught to address their kids' every pain and have them talk about their every pain. But what you just said is completely right. If anyone focuses on their pain, they are less likely to perform the task in front of them and complete it. There's a reason our best basketball coaches and football coaches don't say at halftime, Timmy, would you like to talk about your parents' divorce right now?
Yeah.
They don't do that because they want to win. And the only way to win is say, let's focus on the task ahead. Forget about yourself. Think about what we have to do. And unfortunately, in schools and at homes, instead of focusing on what we have to do, let's talk about your homework. Let's talk about your basketball team. Let's talk about what's going on, what you're learning in class. Instead, their constant question for these kids is, how did that make you feel?
Yeah, yeah. I gotta ask on a personal note, like
Sure.
after the firestorm and ongoing that you had to deal with your last book, and you really very much changed the conversation, where you were kind of a canary in a coal mine. Like, do you really need the headache? Because like now going after like the mental health industry, like it's not like they're gonna be like, brava, Abigail. You know you're going to be dealing with like months and months of completely malevolent attacks that are in total bad faith and that are going to get very personal.
I don't like to see the liars win.
Oh, good. I love
I
that.
just don't
Yeah.
like it. I don't like when lies prevail. And people ask me, they talk about courage or fear and whatever. It's not that I brave, I don't think. It's that I'm actually afraid of a world in which the lies win, in which good people are confused by the lies. And right now, good people are encouraged to hand over to their children to a so-called mental health expert, a child who doesn't have anything wrong with them, when the own parent doesn't believe there's anything wrong with them, and put that child, that mental health expert in charge. It's a damaging thing to do in many cases, and you don't need to do it. And if I can help parents, realize that they know more than they think, then I'll think I've done a good thing.
It reminds me of the Ayn Rand quote. She was asked something similar, and she goes, "I'm not brave enough to be a coward." Where it's kind of like, if you see what's happening and you know you can marginally move the needle, if you keep your mouth shut, it's not gonna get better, it's gonna get worse. So I applaud you, for that. Um, uh, I mean, has being if I get another slightly personal question, but
Sure.
I know the answer, but I still wanna hear you expound on it. How has being a mom, informed your research on this and your previous book? I'm sure it's kinda like would you have been going down this route if you, didn't have children?
Probably not. I mean,
Right.
I was always very interested in the rising generation and what's going on with it. And, um, I will say that it did, the research I did change my parenting, because I learned something. And by the way, Michael, I learned it in part from a lot of immigrant parents. Immigrant parents to America do better than American parents in all sorts of measures. And one of the things we've noticed, they often call it, the immigrant paradox, or the Latino. There's a Latino paradox is one of them, and here's the paradox: why do people with less economic resources have happier kids?
Yeah.
And they do. And one of the things I learned is they were giving more of the kid, they were giving to the kids a happier life in various important ways. And one of the most important is parental authority. Every society has known that kids need parents who
Yep.
believe they're in charge and are in charge, who enforce rules with their kids. And the best research, by the way, going back to the 60s, backs this up. The happiest kids are kids who grow up with what's called authoritative parents. Now, when I say authoritative, that doesn't mean unloving, right? It's not authoritarian parents, what they call, but authoritative parents are loving but rule based. And if you break the rules, there are punishments. And believe it or not, this has been shown again and again to produce not only the happiest kids and most successful kids, but kids who end up actually closer to their parents.
Sometime in the early 80s, REO Speedwagon's airplane made an unannounced, middle-of-the-night landing.
This is my friend Kyle MacLachlan, the star of Twin Peaks. And he's telling me about how he discovered a real-life Twin Peaks in rural North Carolina, not far from where he filmed Blue Velvet.
What was on the plane was copious amounts of drugs coming in from South America. Supposedly, Pablo Escobar went looking for other spots, quiet, out-of-the-way places to bring in his cocaine.
My name is Joshua Davis, and I'm an investigative reporter. Kyle and I talk all the time about the strange things we come across, but nothing was quite as strange as what we found in Varnamtown, North Carolina.
There's crooked cops, brother against brother. Everyone's got a story to tell, but does the truth even exist? Welcome to Varnamtown.
Varnamtown is available wherever you listen to podcasts.
Let's get back to the show. I would encourage everyone watching this right now to take a second and realize what I'm about to say, and you realize to how extent it's true. There is a constant background noise in our culture, just like elevator music, that tells parents they don't know what they're doing.
Right.
And that every aspect, from how do you swaddle the baby, the food for the baby, all the way up through high school, you're not competent enough to raise these kids. You need to even though human beings, and before you were even human, have been doing it for literally millions of years, and you have to outsource all this decision making toward other people. And first of all, it's not, if that were true, humanity would have been extinct. Second of all, it also completely flies in the face of like the feminist message that like, you're a tough, strong, independent woman who like knows what she's doing. But when it comes to being a mom, all of a sudden you're like a complete basket case, and you should just literally just shut up and just obey. It's this weird dichotomy. And I think it's extremely pernicious.
Yeah, and I think largely it is due to the idea that we became convinced that anything could cause our kids trauma,
Yeah.
and that we didn't understand our kids' brains. We were told over and over, and all the best-selling parenting books say this, that you really have to understand what's going on in your child's brain, because if you don't understand the amygdala, you have no shot of raising a good kid. Well, as you just said, That's ridiculous. But I'll tell you something else. I talk to a lot of, I love talking to immigrant parents because they'll tell you the truth and they're not afraid. And a friend of mine, Julia, her mother, Rhoda, called me one day about something. And I said to her, listen, you raised a great woman, not just, a lot of people give parenting advice. They have a 5-year-old, but this woman I had met, her daughter's a friend of mine. I'd seen what a wonderful adult she was. So I said, what are American parents doing wrong? This woman was an immigrant from South Africa. And she said to me, they have no authority with their own children. And then she said something fascinating. She said, that's why these kids are all running to BLM
Yeah,
because
yeah, yeah.
they're looking for daddy. They want somebody in charge. And if their parents won't assert their authority to some extent, which again does not mean being cold or cruel, it just means fundamentally, okay, I set the rules for the household. If they're not willing to do it, very often the kids are so hungry for it, they go running off to these radical movements that are very authoritarian.
I you're a much nicer person than I am, much kinder, and a mom. But I assure you, I have way too much fun replying to people on Twitter saying you don't hate Trump, you hate Dad. The reactions, I think, speak for themselves, and it's a great source of humor for me. But it hits. There is something to that. I would love to hear more of the like what to do, right? Because if you start out here talking about like this isn't irreversible damage, the parents do
Right.
have a large measure of control. Like, what are what are the flags along the way, and what can the parents do at each step to keep their kids from being kind of shunted like Plinko into the wrong slot?
Okay, so it's a great question, and there are a bunch of things parents can do. So, number one, authority. Parents need to be in charge, which doesn't mean, of course, that you never ask a kid, what do if a kid wants, a teenager wants to tell you that they don't agree with a rule, you can listen to them, but the parent ultimately makes the decision. Not a mental health expert mom hired, mom's or dad is in charge of the kid. Okay, that's a really important message. In this home, we go by what the parents say. But there are a few other important things. One is independence. We have taken away all of kids' independence. We give them these phony choices. What would you
Yeah,
like to dye your hair today, Tyler? But we don't give them real independence from the surveillance of adults. Partly because mom and dad are so controlling and they never let a kid grow, give them the independence to develop their own judgment, then they don't trust the kid's judgment. But if a kid doesn't have space from his parents, he never learns to exercise that judgment. But more importantly, in terms of mental health, if he doesn't take a certain number of risks in life, he doesn't actually learn to be able to gauge risks
yeah,
emotionally. And I interviewed researchers who told me, I interviewed this wonderful woman at she runs the Georgetown Emotions Lab. Her name is Yulia Chansova Dutton. And she told me that when she interviews her American students, as opposed to the students from Russia and other countries, they have no ability to gauge risks. They're pretty poor at gauging risks. So they'll mention dangers they had experienced, but these dangerous experiences are really humdrum. They're like seeing someone look at me funny on the street.
yeah,
And of course, we're seeing that these kids are complaining, the rising generation are complaining about the most minor offenses, right? Literally what they call
yeah.
microaggressions, right? And they feel them intensely because they never learned to take risks. They never had real independence. And now every tiny, perceived danger gets magnified to them. But then there's a third thing, and that we don't give them in America, and they do much better with this in other countries, and that is relational stability. In America, we really believe in experts. So we hire the best
Yep.
basketball coach, the best soccer coach, whatever it is, algebra tutor after school. Then you go to do your taekwondo. We don't, but what we don't trust are like cousins, grandma. They won't tell the right jokes. They don't serve the right foods, right? They give them too much gluten or dairy or whatever it is, the new bugaboo. And the problem is relational stability, a set of people who love you and you love back over time is incredibly connected to happiness
Wait,
and emotional stability. Yeah.
if I can interject here, I
Yeah.
argue with conservatives about this all the time because they're always talking about nuclear family, nuclear family, nuclear family. And I was born in the Soviet Union, and I always say it's the extended family because then they're like, it's the same thing. It's not the same thing. Nuclear family is mom, dad, and the kids. Extended family is the cousins, the uncles, the grandmas, and everyone else, because you want to have that safety net. What if mom's an alcoholic? What if dad's a deadbeat or not around, or something bad happens? You have a huge safety net of related people who care about you. So there's backup upon backup upon backup. When it's just the nuclear, just the four, the two, mom, dad, boy, and girl, it's not the same. So I'm very gladdened to hear you say that. And I think I also am kind of, I don't know if disgusted is the word, but I have strong negative response to the kind of contempt in our culture for family. And not just the nuclear family. It's more this kind of thing. They have this concept called chosen family, right? Where it's like going to be your guidance counselor or your teacher or your therapist. That figure will never take the place of blood relations. Now, many parents are not ideal, and many parents are in fact deleterious for certain kids, and that's not nothing, but it's still not going to be the same. That guidance counselor, at the very least, that guidance counselor has 1,000 other kids to worry about.
That's right. And I'll tell you, and by the way, the kid knows it's not the same.
Yes.
See, I love what you said about extended family, because the truth is that was so good for kids. It was so good because you know what? Your uncle joked with you about things that mom didn't approve
Right.
of. And grandma told you stories that might have scared you, or grandpa did. He gave you tools to work with that were dangerous, according to mom, and you survived. And more importantly, you've got the sense I'm connected to all these people who care about me. I'm not just me. And we've lost sense of that in this country. We've lost sense that we no longer give kids a sense. We tell them how unique they are, but we don't give them the sense of, wow, my grandmother survived something much worse and
Yeah.
I can do it too.
Yeah, I've always talked about, to get a little bit political for a second, I always say that Brave New World is much more indicative of where America is going than 1984. We're not having this authoritarian Stalinism. It's more this corporate manipulation through pleasure and medication. So it's like you're gonna watch this dopey show, and if you're bored, take a drug, and if you're down, take another drug. And it's a really effective method, intentionally or otherwise, of societal control. Can you talk a bit about to what extent, and I'm almost scared to ask, the use of medication has increased over the last like generation? It's got to be exponential.
It's really shocking. I know that in the UK, I think it was 1 in 3 teenagers are now on antidepressants.
Oh my God.
In America, they say 1 in 10 was what I saw of people, something like 12 and up. They just approved Lexapro for, I think, 8-year-olds. I
Oh
mean,
my.
you're
Wait,
talking about,
I gotta interrupt you. I'm
yeah,
sorry, because I
the
have a friend of
FDA.
Lexapro. Lexapro is one of those drugs where the side effects are often severe, including like suicidal ideation and things like that, and the withdrawal is pretty high. It's a tough drug. So to give it to an 8-year-old, it's really no joke.
Yeah, the FDA recently approved it, and I'll tell you something for kids, and I'll tell you something else. You know, a kid who's never had a sex drive, if you go in and delete it, you're going
Yeah.
to forever alter that child's development, right? They don't know what it's like to handle a sex drive if they've never learned to have to, right? But there's something else too. I learned this. I had this wacky interview. It was really fascinating with a trans doctor named Marcy Bowers, and one of the things she told me was that she had worked with a lot of patients with female genital mutilation. They had
Right.
survived female genital mutilation. And one of the things she sort of mentioned to me as a side note during our interview was that one of the side effects she learned that they had was they actually struggled to form intimate relationships, because it turns out that our sex drive and the idea of sexual pleasure is actually a driver for intimate relationships. I mean, you could literally be deleting kids' ability to, or even their impetus to
Yeah.
form close relationships. Why would you do that as lightly as we're doing it?
That brings me. I want to talk a bit about your previous book, Irreversible Damage, because you were kind of the first, or one of the first, certainly, to kind of sound the alarm about what's being done to young people in terms of encouraging them to transition if they're just gender nonconforming or certain other things. Um, how do you think the conversation has changed nationally and internationally? Because I think it's quite different, like England and other places, from when you wrote the book to where we are now.
Yeah, in Europe, I think the conversation has completely changed from what I gather. The number of clinics that have come out and either shuttered or said we've got to completely redo our protocols across Northern Europe and continental Europe is remarkable, and I think it's very encouraging. In America, I guess it's no longer seen as impolite to point out the side effects. Even the New York Times will cover it, and you know that if the New York Times is
Yeah.
willing to cover it, it must be so obvious at this point that they can't deny it any longer. But I think it's a big slog ahead still. And part of the reason, not only because we don't have centralized medical care, so it's harder in America to just shut it down, but the other problem is, and of course, our medical accrediting institutions have all been co-opted. So the Endocrine Society, the American Medical Association, all of these are very woke, and they are very insistent on denying the harms of gender transitioning medications. But the other problem in our country is we have this longstanding protocol called affirmative care,
Yeah.
which is the idea that a therapist's job is to agree with the patient's self-diagnosis. So you're supposed to agree with a teenager who says she has gender dysphoria and she's supposed to be a boy. The mandate is to agree with her, and that's going to make it a lot harder to sue and to really shut this down.
You and I are around the same age, and I'm sure you remember during high school, I don't know if it was a majority, but a huge percentage of girls had eating disorders of some kind. And now instead of being it's about control, being uncomfortable in your body, unwanted male attention, all the things that happen with being a teenager in America. Now I think that same phenomenon is resulting in, teenage girls transitioning. But the difference is you can outgrow much easier an eating disorder than, surgeries or your hormonal imbalances. But imagine if, in the 80s, you sat down and you said, someone who's anorexic, you can see, every bone, and they go, I think I'm fat. And therapists affirm that. Yep, you're fat. Like, I mean, you hear it and it's like, okay, this is absolutely crazy, right? But it's the same thing.
That's right. It's crazy. It was always crazy. And one of the things I learned from my last book that was so disturbing was that not only had therapists played a major role in the epidemic of kids, teenage girls deciding they were transgender and wanting these hormones and surgeries, um, but it wasn't gender therapists. It wasn't always activist therapists who believed in gender ideology. Actually, many of the therapists that had pushed a girl onto this, encouraged her along this bad path, were just vanilla therapists, and they were hired by the parents to deal with the girl's anxiety or depression.
Right.
And in the course, I guess when they were done talking about what's wrong with her mom and all the mean things that mom or dad does to her, they then move on to, so tell me about your gender. And they were creating a lot of mischief.
And the other kind of unspoken aspect to this is that testosterone is really great for self-esteem and mental health. So you have these females who are having mental issues. They put them on testosterone. All of a sudden, they feel confident, they feel strong, and all this other stuff. And it's like, look, it worked. So it becomes this kind of validating thing. And maybe it works in a very specific, narrow way, but in the broader context, it most certainly does not. And not to mention, even if it does work, the cost is that girl will never have children. It's just one example, and they're never told this.
Yeah, our belief that a pill is a solution to
Yeah.
every heartache is a bad one. It really is. The old school attitude of, wait a second, let's see if I can do okay without taking a pill. That solves a lot of problems.
Folks, head on over to malice.locals.com where Abigail will be taking questions from supporters. I saw on your Wikipedia that irreversible damage was banned in Japan, or technically they were going to translate it, then they changed their mind. I'm shocked that it would be Japan of all places. This would have taken such a hold. Can you speak on that?
Sure, because I have big news. Ready?
Oh, uh-oh.
So after my Japanese publisher canceled the book, there was a
Yeah.
bidding war in
Oh,
Japan among the other
okay.
publishers. So they
Okay.
actually bid up the book, and now there's a new publisher in Japan.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, that I'm great. But I would think of all places, Japan would not be high up on that list. Were you surprised by that?
Social contagion travels across the world because of the internet, right?
Yeah.
So the way we present things in the media really matters with social contagion. There was this amazing study in Vienna in the subway system. They had these subway suicides in Vienna in the 1990s. And there was this amazing study that we know that suicide can be very contagious. So they decided, you know what we're going to do in the media? We're going to stop publicizing the suicide. We're going to stop valorizing the subject of the suicide, and we're going to stop presenting suicide as a method of coping with suicide.
Yeah.
And suicide rate in Vienna dropped by 75%.
I, I know one criticism you're going to get, so let's get. I
Yeah,
want you to
sure.
get ahead of it. You're
Sure.
not a doctor. You're not a shrink. Why are you running your mouth? You know what you're talking about, right? You're going to get that every single day.
You know, this is perhaps the most insincere criticism of all, right? Because what do journalists do, right? We investigate things and we talk
Uh,
to experts and we
uh,
report.
no, you lie in favor of the regime. That's what journalists
Right.
do.
I mean, like, so why didn't a therapist write this book?
Right.
Well, it takes a lot of guts and to write a book that calls out the other therapists. I mean, journalists exist to expose, bad things that are going on in various industries where, the doctor doesn't want to rat out his own patients under his own name or his own, colleagues under his own name, or, a banker doesn't want to rat out what was going on at his bank or whatever it is. So they talk to a journalist. So that's what I do is a very standard journalism. I do investigations into, areas where lies are prevailing, and I try to expose them.
Abigail, we're running out of time. What has been your favorite part of this interview?
Oh, well, meeting you was fantastic. But I loved what you had to say about, the costs and benefits, that we don't take seriously the costs. We pretend that some policy or idea can only be good. And you definitely see that with therapy. It's not saying all therapy is bad to point out that it can have negative side effects. Of course it does. It really just takes a brain.
You are welcome.
Pluto TV is as easy as it is free, and it's totally free. With over 300 channels and thousands of TV shows and movies, finding what you love has never been easier. Just open the app and something good will already be playing. Because it's curated by real humans who love TV as much as you do. So you'll spend a lot less time scrolling and a whole lot more time watching. That's why Pluto TV is TV the way it should be. All you need to do is download the app and start streaming. Pluto TV. Stream now, pay never.